Very good.
What are the limitations of the New World Order created by the rise of transnational regimes and global business begun after the Second World War and reaching crescendo in our own century? Are there limits to the proffered vision of globalization as a positive force, supported by its own set of mythologies and values? Is the so-called new nationalism or new populism that in 2016 brought us Brexit and the election of Donald Trump a reaction to the excesses of the New World Order? Are there positive aspects of those movements, or are they simply fundamentally revanchist? I shall address these questions in the context of current political movements, primarily the MAGA, M-A-G-A, Make America Great movement of President Trump in the United States. At the onset, I must try to imagine how some Europeans must worry about the rise of Trumpism. As the French national philosopher Pierre Manon points out, the idea of the European Union has been, even from its very beginning, something more than a trade union. It represents a collective transformation of the hearts and minds of Europeans, who for decades have been led into bloody conflicts by ideas of blood, place, and faith, best described as nationalism. The wish to create a new Europe is at the heart of a wish to create a new European who is tolerant of cultural differences and who thinks of himself as a citizen of Europe or indeed of the whole world. Although from time to time the rank and file rejects that vision, that project must move on according to the leaders. The new multicultural Europe will, for them, become a model for the whole earth. Now, to those who feel that way, Trump sounds dangerous. It's very easy for them to see him as a proto-fascist, their favorite slur for anyone who questions the premise that nationalism needs to be reconstructed from the ground up. At the very least, Trump sounds like he'll bring down international cooperation. His criticisms of NATO, his pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, his reversal of the Obama deals in Iran and Cuba are examples. Now, I'm going to give you a different view, one from inside the USA, one indeed from inside the MAGA movement. But I want to make something clear at the beginning. I am not oblivious to the dangers of nationalism. I'm not oblivious to the dangers of jingoistic thinking that creates enemies and borders and vilifies those who are not like us. Obviously, there are elements of those forces in the MAGA movement, in the Brexit movement, in the new nationalism of today. What my concern is that we not paint with too broad a brush and miss what I believe to be the truly valuable and indeed progressive aspects of those movements. In 2016, the earth shook. Nigel Farage and the UKIP party led a revolt against the Brussels bureaucrats that resulted in a vote for Brexit. In Italy, Matteo Renzi's center-left government fell after he called a referendum on constitutional reforms, and the populist Movimento Cinque Stelle gained ground. But the greatest shockwave of all occurred on the evening of November 8th. Donald J. Trump was elected President of the United States with more electoral votes than any Republican since George H.W. Bush in 1988, and only 7% fewer votes than Barack Obama in his second election. The New York Times had predicted on that afternoon of Election Day that Trump had a 15% or less chance of winning. The polls suddenly turned from blue to red, and by 10:45 p.m. that night, the same publication put Trump's chances of winning at greater than 97%. What followed in ensuing months, after exactly one day of apologies from the media to the effect that they had perhaps focused on the wrong predictors, was a preposterous effort to blame Trump's victory on something else. There was the charge of racism, attached to Trump because he opposes illegal immigration made up largely of Hispanics and because of some comments he made about banning Muslim immigration. A CNN commentator, Van Jones, called Trump's election a white lash, an embarrassingly unartful attempt at a neologism. Mr. Jones, himself a black man, seemed to be suggesting that the racist Americans had reacted against Obama, whom they had voted for twice because they had remembered they were racists. He didn't explain how voting for an old white woman was not racist, but voting for an old white man was. Right alongside the racist accusation was the sexist one. This stemmed not from the fact that Trump companies lead their industries in the numbers of female executives or in measures of women's pay, but about some locker room talk surreptitiously recorded in the back of a bus 11 years earlier. That language, of course, came right from the Hillary campaign that did little but level personal attacks on Trump, lulled by a sense of entitlement and inevitability, as new revelations from Insider Campaign now indicate. The leading theory, as of this writing, among the Trump deniers is that Russia somehow hacked the election. Several Obama leftovers in the intelligence services have disclosed this hypothesis, mainly through a series of leaks to the press. Yet, they admit that no voting systems were sabotaged, no votes were changed. The accusations vaguely suggest that the Russians engaged in disinformation campaigns and may have given Hillary's emails that were hacked because they were stored in violation of government laws and policies on private, poorly secured email systems to WikiLeaks. Trump, like all presidents-elect, engaged in overtures to foreign governments. His enemies, who were legion, are claiming he colluded illegally with Russia against the interests of the United States. Again, there's simply, as of now, no hard evidence of this. Other responses to Trump's victory were more enlightening and highlighted the deeper significance of Brexit and the MAGA movements in America. French political scientist Jean Dumont wrote in an article in February 2017 entitled Néron à la Maison Blanche, ou la fin du néolibéralisme. The article showed how Trumpism was not limited to the United States, and how it was more than just a rankavist response. His statements were similar to those of another political theorist, Mark Blyth, whose comments on global Trumpism have drawn some notice. Blyth was smart enough to see that there are right-wing and left-wing versions of Trumpism, and pointed to Greece's Syriza movement as an example of the latter. There are many casualties of the dominant economic and political systems that the left likes to style as neoliberalism. The middle class, in many Western countries over the last 30 years, has lost ground economically, and more wealth has been gained by smaller and smaller percentages of the population. In the United States, the Democratic Party has responded to this with an effort to build a coalition of minorities and affluent white urban dwellers, ignoring its traditional base of white middle-class working men and women, but wildly enthusiastic in pursuing issues like gay marriage and transsexual bathrooms. All the while, the Democrats, like the Republicans, have worked closely with elites in promoting economic policies that make the globalist dream of free movement of goods, free movement of capital, and free movement of labor a reality. Consistently, they have ignored localism, community, and solidarity in the natural and traditional ways those things function in society. We are all now part of virtual, ideologically defined communities, which exist no place for no real people. In a strange jumble, the social groups that have the least social cohesion and stability often are relentlessly referred to as communities. So we hear again and again of the black community, but never of the Ivy League graduates community. Most of the international human rights regime, regrettably, has played into this, despite the great advances that that movement has brought to humankind. So we are now crazed about our own rights, and now also about the rights of people from foreign lands who are seeking benefits from our citizens. By contrasting Trumpism and movements like it talk of duties, obligations, and responsibilities of citizens. Is this fascism, or is it simply part of the reality of any polity? Jean de Monts and his kind acknowledge the crisis of neoliberalism and wish we would embrace a socialist answer to the problems. But many countries, even as we write, are losing faith in such an approach. This drives the left rather crazy. They, in moments of candor, refer to those on the other side as, quote, a basket of deplorables, racist, sexist, homophobic, and think them irredeemable, to use Hillary Clinton's own words. Or, if they are in a more patronizing mood, they'll pity the opponents for having been led astray by leaders like Trump, whom they consider a charlatan. Their hatred of Trump is blinding. The monk referred to him as puerile and vulgar, literally a drooling madman. Meanwhile, he described Obama as elegant, sophisticated, a hero of the American dream. But this hero led his party off the cliff for the last 8 years. Democrats suffered a net loss of 1,042 seats nationwide during Mr. Obama's 8-year tenure. Outrageous claims about Trump's motives, personality, or even sanity seem like childish responses to a reality that the monks of the world never really saw coming. The failures of capitalism are seen by them as part of a scenario outlined by Marx about the eventual collapse of capitalism. Their apparent sympathy with Trump voters is at best pity. The poor souls really think Trump is going to help them. After the collapse of the Soviet communist regime, the leftist theorists are still waiting for the inevitable dialectic shift in which the proletariat finally rises. Trump's appeal, however, is populist, reformist, communitarian, and nationalist. It is not primarily racist or sexist. Those are Molotov cocktails hurled at the opposition by fanatics. Trump won a larger percentage of Hispanic and black votes than the racist Mitt Romney did in 2012. Trump's reformist agenda is the boldest we've seen in a generation. It's part of a worldwide movement to correct the excesses of globalism, which has led to economic dislocation, brought about by the creation of worldwide production chains, free trade, which is often not free at all, but highly regulated by prolix treaties and agreements, an integrated world banking system, and the disruption of local industries by automation and cross-border competition. The irony of that position will not be lost on most of you. How is it that Trump, or any American politician, can complain about the New World Order that the United States, more than any single country, is responsible for creating? Isn't the system the product of the American century? Now, herein lies the complexity of the new nationalism. Trump, in fact, does complain that the New World Order leaves out the majority of Americans. They can look at shuttered factories, falling middle-class wages, and the rise of new classes of super rich, controlling more and more of the nation's wealth as proof. They also see the political classes operating explicitly with global business and producing deals like TTP and NAFTA, or the admittance of China into the WTO that don't seem to make a lot of sense to them. They can also react to the seeming loss of sovereignty that international agreements made by the political elite indicates. Obama's hallmark international deals, Paris, Iran, and Havana, for instance, were all made without the approval of Congress, which, by the way, is why Trump could so easily reverse them. The MAGA movement shares this zeal for national sovereignty with populist Greek movements perhaps the Eurosceptic movement, UKIP, and Italy's regional Lega Nord, neo-fascist Fratelli d'Italia, and comedian Beppe Grillo's Movimento Cinque Stelle, which is radically anti-elitist while refusing any left-right characteristics. It seems that people want to feel they have a say in their own political affairs. They want localism, rooted in land that they have inherited, in which their forebears' bones are buried. The fact that Italians, Austrians, or Romanians might feel that way is obvious because of the way their homelands have been transformed by political machinations in the recent past. That Americans could join them in feeling the same way in a secure, separated land which is at the center of an empire is an irony that should speak to us of the power of the things that the New World Order tries to ignore. Trumpism is also an attack on bureaucracy and government overreach and inefficiency. That a man who had never held political office was able to win the presidency remains deeply objectionable to a whole class of professional pundits, politicians, media members, lobbyists, pollsters, and operatives, a group that Trump refers to simply as the swamp. Right now, they have the support of many members of the government who are working to subvert the president's agenda and even to remove him from office. Their loyalty to the status quo is greater than to any political party. They have made Washington one of the most affluent cities in America and see Trump as a threat to their greater success. The MAGA movement also threatens traditional news media, which through newspapers, TV, and radio have for decades played a major role in interpreting events for people. With the new disruptive technologies like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, people can see and hear things for themselves. Often, they have different opinions than others who just happen to be working for the media. Newspapers, for instance, in America are in sharp decline, as is the consumption of TV news. The New York Times and Washington Post, once bastions of American political journalism, today continue only because they are supported by the revenues of new technologies which enrich their wealthy new owners. So Jeff Bezos pours his Amazon millions into the Post, and Mexico's Carlos Slim his telecom dollars into the Times. Trump routinely denounces the mainstream media as corrupt, biased, outmoded, and find ways to go directly to the people, for instance, through Twitter. So there's much more to Trumpism than a simple economic analysis. But for the commentators like DeMunk and Blythe, the more is racism and sexism. This is a stunningly ideological approach that shows their continuing reliance on Marxism and the distorted cultural variants of the Frankfurt School that throw into the toxic mix of elements of Foucauldian psychoanalysis, revisionist history, and agnosticism. Advocates of Trump's MAGA movement would respond by saying their movement is not about hate, but about love, not about division, but about unity, not about scapegoating, but about solidarity. It's about Americanism and not internationalism. And they would say that that's not unique. In addition to those groups already mentioned, there is the Alternative for Germany, the FPO in Austria, the PPV in the Netherlands, the National Front in Belgium, the PRNR in Portugal, Marine Le Pen's National Front in France, Duda's movement in Poland, Viktor Orban and Fidesz in Hungary, and Milos Zeman in the Czech Republic. And on the edges of Europe, of course, there's Recep Erdogan in Turkey and Vladimir Putin in Russia. And who could leave out in discussing nationalism? China. I'll be traveling there next month to give a series of lectures on a conference on the new emerging values brought about by globalism. And there I'll suggest we be careful lest we find ourselves responding to issues that are 20 years old and that we miss the new wave of localism, national identity, and emplacement in our own unique cultures, a rejection of being citizens of the world in favor of being citizens of real, non-virtual places, villages and towns, cities and countries, not the United Nations, the European Union, the North American Trade Zone, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Economic agreements that facilitate global trade or international security arrangements that ally the interests of nations in self-defense, of course, are essential, as they have always been. Much has been gained by the increase of commerce among nations and the brisk exchange of ideas among cultures. Yet, critics assert that the business models that have become social models, and the EU is a prime example of that. They've become much more than simply outlines for the exchange of goods and capital. What needs to be re-examined is the myth of globalization that lies behind this. And it's based on several assumptions. One is the idea that artificial political and legal structures imposed from the top down can create a new way to self-identity for persons. Human exchange has always been part of history. It has always brought about change in the way people think of themselves. Just how they thought of themselves would be as varied and as unique as the persons and cultures involved. By contrast, today, the profits of globalization offer us a more limited set of options, and we are all supposed to think like them. Everyone is supposed to like Big Macs. Everyone is supposed to listen to American music on their Chinese-made iPhones. Everyone wants to drive the same cars, see the same movies. Pop culture, defined by commercialization, is manufactured, sold, and consumed. It creates a simulacrum of a culture, superficial, perfect for 140-character tweets or 60-second videos, but unable to meet the larger needs for society that humans have had for millennia. Rich and lasting cultural symbols grow organically over generations. They are refined by thousands of individual choices and passed on only because they work to make life better. They cannot be made in factories or produced in the halls of the United Nations. They must grow from the ground up. When Trump says America first, but then adds that he expects other nations to act the same way, is that a return to the dark ages of international conflict? When he addresses the Arab and Islamic summit in Riyadh, and says, we're not going to tell you how to live. We'll put our own interests first and expect you to do the same and look for areas in which we can have common agreement and make deals. Could this transactional approach to international relations be a welcome relief to the mad nation building of the Bush era and neocons? So, for example, if President Trump tells Chancellor Merkel that Germany is not paying its fair share of NATO expenses, is that damaging to international relations? Or does it add a frankness and realism to the discussions and in the long run improve NATO? The MAGA movement is also a reaction against mendacity, which takes the form today of political correctness and mock concern for the poor of the world. In fact, much of political correctness functions to add a moral simulacrum to a greed-based culture of the global economy. So Bill Gates, for example, after giving away billions in a much publicized campaign in which he urged other billionaires to join, somehow becomes massively wealthier after that and magically retains his title as the world's richest man. We are asked to believe that he and Warren Buffett, who talk about wanting to pay more taxes but somehow keep getting richer and richer, suddenly are perplexed about children in Africa, and that the developing of a massive labor pool in Africa and a massive consumptive pool has little to do with their largesse. So we are told we cannot say plain things to people, that we must follow speech codes or must feel guilty for wrongs committed in the past, or we must not express our adherence to traditional morality. It's not that any of these things is necessarily bad in itself. Of course, sensitive and polite people would certainly not wish to offend others in their speech, but the aggressive moral police of the New World Order wish to disallow the rights of those who do not believe what they believe. They do not even want to hear other viewpoints, and would, if they were able, punish their opponents for even thinking differently. Political correctness is an example of a top-down approach to civility and harmony. A demand, not an offering, an imposition, not a crudescence, the work of prigs and spoiled children, not of persons of virtue. And millions have had enough of it. In closing, what I've suggested is the possibility of the development of a critical nationalism, critical of the negative parts of nationalism that can lead to doom, but receptive and positively inclined to those things we might be losing.